Okay, so here with me, I've got Catherine Pearson and Ragni. I don't think I've ever said your surname.
Omni.
Omni.
Yeah.
So in the content team under Veronica Rios, Ragni and Kat are practice area leads, and I'm a practice area manager. And we put together this presentation mainly for the REPH editors who we work with every day. And then it became apparent this presentation would also be useful for other teams across REPH, so that's why we're presenting it today. It's not meant to be a particularly formal presentation, so if you have any questions or comments, feel free to interrupt us at any time. This is a rough outline of what we'll be going through today. We have got our names next to particular parts that we'll be focusing on, but all three of us will be contributing throughout. And yeah, like I said, let us know if you have any questions throughout the presentation. And the whole idea behind this presentation was to provide a response to one that we received last year from Fred, who was one of the execs at REPH. I don't know if any of you would have come across him. He visited us in Sydney last year and gave us a very similar presentation with facts and figures about Filipino culture to help us to understand how you all work. So we wanted to present a response to that. So we'll be covering everything from what our offices are like here in Chatswood to how business culture, how the businesses operate in Australia and how what business culture is like, our approach to things like social media, Australian language, and some terms that you may have but not necessarily aren't necessarily familiar with, as well as general things like life in Australia, law and politics, personal life, hobbies, history, and Australian icons. And it's important to remember that some of the things we'll be covering here are general, so we're not saying that every single Australian in the entire country is like this, but what we're covering are general trends or themes that you're likely to come across if you were to work in Australia and when you do work with Australians from the Philippines. So the first slide here, we've got outlined some general facts about Australia with a map. So Australia is one of the 7 continents of the world. It is quite large, but most of it is actually desert, and most people live on the east coast, so places like Sydney. There are 6 states and 2 territories, and we've also added in here our national colours, green and gold, which you see our sporting teams wearing. These colours come from our national tree, which is called the wattle. Our capital city is Canberra in the Australian capital territory. Our population is around 20 million. Our currency, Australian dollars, and our national language, English. So it's a bit different to the Philippines, where a lot of you speak more than one language. Most Australians only speak one language, and those who speak more than one language typically have learnt it because their parents have come from another country and they've picked up the language from their parents. We do tend to learn some other languages like French or German or Japanese at school, but typically Australians are only fluent in one language, which is English. Our government, we're a representative democracy and constitutional monarchy, which means our head of state is the Queen and she's represented by the Governor General, but we also have a Prime Minister. His name is Tony Abbott.
Just something which is interesting, I think, on this map, as Rita said before, is that even though the map looks quite green itself, in fact, most of Australia is desert, and if you have a look at the east coast, so from Queensland down to Melbourne, that's where the majority of the people live. And each, you all know this already, but each state has its own capital city. So Sydney, while it's not the capital of the country, it's the capital of New South Wales. Perth is the capital of Western Australia. Brisbane is the capital of Queensland. and so on.
And the Prime Minister is kind of like president. Like,
Yeah.
he's not the head of state, but he's the
the
most
ultimate.
important, or she, as the former Prime Minister was, most important politician.
So, following that, are there any questions? Can you hear us properly?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Moving on now so we've looked at Australia as a whole. This slide basically gives you some background as to where we are in Sydney. So we work in a suburb called Chatswood, which is marked on the map there. It's about 20 minutes away from the sea, which you can see in the photo there. Depending on where we are in our office, we can actually see the harbour, well, not necessarily the harbour, but the CBD with the Centrepoint Tower there and the bridge. So, yeah, Chatswood isn't necessarily, I guess, a big central business district, but it is very close to the city, and I guess you can say it's quite in terms of it being a business area as well as urban. How would you guys describe it?
It's a bit of a hub. I think of it as a bit like little Singapore, to be honest. Yeah, because it's just it's what it reminds me of. It's got lots of shopping malls and a very large Chinese and Korean population.
Yeah.
When you compare it to other parts of Sydney, so loads of shops and loads of this massive high-rise apartments as well, which you don't generally see.
Yeah.
In other parts of Sydney.
Yeah, well, high-rise by Australian standards
Yeah.
is to emphasise.
Oh, we did have one building. I can't look at the top. Like, I'm like.
Scary. Yeah.
And while the CBD in the city might be the business district in that's where the majority of our workers work and where we have the densest office buildings, Chatswood and other places like North Sydney are also quite important worker hubs where people commute in and out of every day. Yeah. But they're sort of divided up and separated by other suburban areas. So it's not one big business district. They're little satellite districts, I guess.
Yeah, satellite district is the way to describe it, I think. And Ragni's point about there being a big Chinese and, did you say Korean population in Chatswood relates very much to, I guess, the makeup of our office here in Chatswood. So what we're looking at here is some pictures from our National Food Day last year. So we have various events and lunches and other things throughout the year, but we pulled out these photos to show you how diverse our office environment is. There isn't really one describing what an Australian is and what they look like. Australians come from all over the world. They're people whose families have, been here ever since Australia started, to other people like me whose parents migrated here. My parents are from Egypt, for example. They've been here for about 35 years and I was born here. So, and I understand it's probably a bit tricky to get your mind around it because there is, I guess, if you were to describe a Filipino, there is one way to describe a Filipino, but the thing to remember about Australians is that there's no one way to describe us, and we're quite diverse. We're from all over the world. So moving on now to business culture. A big thing to note in relation to Australia's business culture is that there is definitely an obvious separation between our private life and our work life. So in the work environment, it's not as people will be friends or that they'll be talking about their personal lives or that they'll even know about each other's personal lives. People can have what we call a personal facade and a professional facade. So even if they are friends with people from work, outside of work, the way that we behave at work is very different to the way that we are outside of work in those relationships or friendships. There are clear boundaries between the two. So Australians typically come across as professional in the work environment. That means not necessarily asking personal questions. That means being direct. Even though we're informal and easygoing, we value being direct, which is covered on this slide, but also we don't tend to refer to our superiors as Miss, Ma'am, or Sir. I know that that does happen in the Philippines. Even though we're professional, we just call each other by our first names. Another part of our business culture is that we tend to be prompt and on time. So if there's a meeting starting at 1:30, we're ready at 1:30, and the meeting actually starts at that time. Even though Australians are emotional just like everybody else in the world, we try to keep our emotional issues out of the work environment. Even if there is an issue to deal with, we try to be forward and direct about it, but not necessarily emotional in the work environment. And another thing that we noticed from Fred's presentation last year is that often in our communications with the Manila team, we might find that people respond to us by saying yes and not necessarily meaning yes, or saying no and not necessarily meaning no. But an important part of Australian business culture is that we're very direct in our answers. So when we say yes, it means. When we say no, we mean no. If we don't understand something, we tend to ask questions. It's really important to have communication, in the business environment to make sure everyone's clear on what's going on. And obviously, we're not saying that there isn't any other country in the world that has a similar business culture, because that this is generally how it is in Australia.
And of course, this doesn't all mean that we don't talk about our personal lives at work at all. Yeah. I think the emphasis that we're trying to make is that we do have, as Rita said, a professional facade and a personal facade, and as much as possible we try and keep them separately. But of course, we have people who I'm really friendly with at work who we will talk about, our weekends and our partners and children and what's going on in our lives. But generally, we try and keep it as neutral and impersonal as possible. Yeah. Particularly with people that we don't have very close working relationships with.
Yeah, so we're not saying that we're all robots and that we come to work and we're not friendly and we don't have any friends. All we're saying is that when there is work to be done, the focus is very much on the work and on being professional and addressing each other in an appropriate way and in communicating in a way that gets the message across. So even if we are really good friends with somebody at work, we might meet up with them on the weekend, have a great time, but when we're at work, our focus is work, and that might mean that we don't get to, have a joke together or have a laugh because we're focusing on work.
Yeah, and I think also the other thing about having the professional facade and the personal facade is that you're more, when you sort of look at work in a more impersonal way, it allows you to own up to mistakes. Like, I will make mistakes and I'll just say to my manager, I made a mistake. And there's no real emotion attached to it. It's just, okay, I made the mistake. What can we do to fix it? On the other side of the coin, we're kind of expected to, if we do get sort of constructive criticism, if you like, we just kind of, the idea is we sort of take it on the chin and doesn't really impact you too much, because you're like, well, this is just a work thing. This isn't a personal thing. Obviously, that there's gradients and it's not absolute, but that's sort of one of the benefits, I think, of not bringing your personal emotions too much to
and
work.
Not taking it as a personal slight.
Yeah, it doesn't, if just because you did something wrong, it doesn't, something's messed up under your watch, it doesn't really, it's all just work, and at the end of the day we're working together to try and get the work done, not, deal with whatever crushed egos or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, which comes back to the point about not liking to talk around issues and needing direct answers when questions are being asked. So I guess Australians tend to take people at face value if we're talking to somebody, especially if something has gone wrong and we ask a question. We expect that, yeah, if they give an answer, that's what they mean. There's no hidden meaning behind it. And yeah, that's why it's important that we do talk clearly about what's going on rather than giving answers that don't necessarily reflect the situation. And like I said, you know, obviously there are many people around the world who prefer that approach, but you know, this is just giving a general indication of how Australian business culture operates.
And I think maybe the point on the next slide about camaraderie and friendship before, talking about things like Facebook, on the next slide, before talking about things like Facebook, which Rita's going to talk about, this idea of there being a difference between camaraderie and friendship illustrates it better.
Yeah, definitely. Ragni, I don't know if you did want to go on the next slide. You can do it, or I can do it. I don't know.
So a big point that we want to make is all around social media and the use of Facebook versus things like Yammer and LinkedIn. So in Australia, Facebook is seen as something that we use for our personal networking and personal purposes. We don't tend to rely on Facebook for anything to do with work and for posting work-related updates. Anything to do with work, we tend to use Yammer and LinkedIn. So if it can be anything from updating people within the company about our products to setting up a profile so that future employers can see us on LinkedIn, anything like that. It really needs to stay within Yammer and LinkedIn rather than Facebook. So we do find that colleagues add each other on Facebook if they have Facebook accounts. One thing to remember is that not everybody uses Facebook. I don't use it. I used to, but I don't anymore. It's not expected that if you work together, you will be friends on Facebook. We do see Facebook as being very much separate from work and our work lives. People might choose not to be friends with colleagues on Facebook, and that doesn't necessarily mean there's conflict between them or that there's any cause for offence there. It's just a personal choice and an expectation that people befriend each other on Facebook just because they're together. And that all comes back to that general trend I mentioned earlier about personal and work life remaining completely separate and there being clear boundaries between the two. And as Ragni mentioned, there can be a sense of camaraderie between colleagues in the workplace, and that's very different to friendship. And that is reflected in the way people use Facebook versus Yammer and LinkedIn. So friendship is very much seen as something that happens in your personal lives, and even if you are friends with people at work, you tend to treat them more like comrades at work rather than as best buddies. We always have a laugh with and do personal things together at work. In particular, relationships between managers and non-managers are very much restricted to the personal sphere in Australia. It's not really that common to see that managers are friends with their team members outside of work, even if they do happen to be friendly with each other. There's a clear line between how they are outside of work and how they operate with each other within the workplace. It comes back to what Ragni said earlier about there being a difference in the way people operate with each other personally as opposed to professionally. Did you have anything else to add there? This was your slide, sorry.
That's okay. I guess the thing is that friendships are very equal. Like it's two people coming together and there. So it can be difficult to be friends. So I'm not a manager, but I have managers who are friends. But when we're not at work and we're in friendship mode, if you like, the dynamic between us is really different from how it is when we're together in a meeting room at work. So we sort of have two ways of relating to each other. One is the kind of the hierarchical, I don't know how to say this word, corporate, sort of corporate relationship. And then the other is a much more sort of egalitarian, personal friendship realm. And as far as friendships in the workplace go, I always think of work as being one of those places which is like ripe soil or fertile soil for developing friendships. But it's a friendship is something that happens outside of work more than inside of work. It's just a place where friendships may occur, but that's not to say that I'm not fond of people who are not my friends, strictly speaking. It's just the relationship is not necessarily the same.
Yeah. Yeah, and I really want to emphasize that point about, it's important not to take offense if people don't want to be friends with you on Facebook because you work together, because you may well be pretty friendly at work and, pretty close, but it's just a personal choice whether or not you want to interact outside of work on Facebook. And another thing to note is that there have been a number of legal cases in Australia where employees have gotten in trouble for their use of Facebook in relation to their work. So it could be anything posting confidential information about their work on Facebook, or it could be
they have about their manager.
Yeah, making complaints about people at work or the workplace. So that's another reason why Australians do keep work, well, I guess most Australians tend to keep work of Facebook because it can get us into trouble if we use Facebook inappropriately in relation to our work and our workplace. Is that all clear so far? Are there any questions?
No questions so far, but the content is really informative for us, and this will be very useful, especially for our incoming new hire for the team. The topic that you're discussing is really very important before they get to understand the company itself.
That's great to hear.
Yeah, the only just one last thing I just wanted to add is I think, one of the reasons we have this big difference between friendship and camaraderie in the workplace does go back to what we were talking about with the diversity of the Australian population, because people are so different religious perspectives and different personal lives and all the rest of it, you kind of, I don't know, there's...
You don't want to create friction.
Yeah.
In your working relationships, because you might have a different religious belief
to
somebody that you're working with, and you might feel very strongly about it.
Yeah.
But if you raise that with a person at work, it can create tension and issues where it's not necessarily appropriate.
Yeah. You don't assume that the person you sit next to is going to share your views on various issues. You assume they're probably going to have a different view, and they can keep that to themselves, and you'll keep your own views to yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And we're covering a bit more about religion and various other issues later in the slides. Rosemary, did you want to?
Okay, so I'm going to, just as an example of Australian English, you might not understand what I'm about to say. So this is just an example of how Australians speak with each other on the weekend when they've had a few drinks and that kind of thing. Yeah, don't mind being a bogan, but don't tell me I'm a drongo. First thing in the morning, I put my cosy on and my mate puts on his budgie smugglers and go for a dip. In the arvo, we'll open our prezzies and chuck a prawn on the barbie. You've got buckleys of getting anything. It's going to be chockers. Too right, I'm talking about Chrissy, so don't chuck a wobbly or get all cocky on me. A good Chrissy is hard yakka, but at the end of it all, we'd like to have a nice bicky and a cuppa, if not a top drop and a tinny or two. So basically, I was just talking about Christmas then. But this is Australian English strictly for personal interactions. It's definitely not workplace, even though any Australian will understand what I just said. They don't speak like that at work. We've got a whole bunch of different ways of using language. Essentially, they're all revolved around abbreviating words. And we also have a different way of spelling. Interestingly, we are the only people in the world whose version of Australian English is definitely ISE spelling. So you see realise, not realise. In the UK, New Zealand, America, that would be IZ, whereas in Australia it's ISE. Same for similar words like organise, optimise, and so on. The fellow drinking a beer or and having we call it a fag or a ciggy, a cigarette in his mouth, that's a stereotype from the 80s. People don't really, they do look like that. I guess
they do.
A tradesman would look like that. So a carpenter or electrician might look like that. The words of phrases are all a bit, the nature of slang is it changes sort of every 30 years. So they're all a little bit out of date. But just to let you know that we do have a distinctive way of speaking to each other, if not writing. But it's something that we tend to have for each other in informal situations. Your stereotypical situation with barbecue. I confess I go to very few barbecues, but in theory they're very Australian. And
I'm having one on the weekend.
Yeah, you see, exactly. The barbecue is the quintessential Australian social function, and I have to say the smell of steak barbecue is my idea of the best smell in the world. Yeah.
And Ragni, I mean, she said that these types of words and abbreviations are sort of limited to the personal realm. But I have to admit, I find myself sometimes using these Australian expressions and abbreviations when I don't mean to. I know that I've had conversations with some of my REPH editors in the past, and they've had to ask me, I have no idea what you're talking about because I don't understand the expressions that you're using. So things like arvo, I'll accidentally instead of afternoon, or I'll say bicky, or I mean, we all refer to ourselves as Aussie. We don't say we're Australian, we say we're Aussie.
Yeah.
Uni is a very common one. We hardly ever say university. Say I'm going to go to uni.
That's true. Yeah.
So they are in common use. There are other things like, and I mean, Macca's. Most people don't say McDonald's. We all say Macca's. Other things like Chrissy and Cuppa and Cardi and things like that are more sort of the next level of language use. But there are definitely common usage terms that we use but don't necessarily encourage you to adopt.
Yeah, definitely, especially because in fielding customer queries, you're often responding to people who are quite senior in the legal profession. I guess the rule of thumb is to always make sure that you use the full word and avoid abbreviations unless that's how the customer is speaking to you. So some people, I know even barristers or whatever might email you and say cheers at the end. I guess that gives you an indication that they're okay with being informal, but it shouldn't be assumed from the start. You should always at least start off by communicating with them in a formal way, and if the conversation progresses and they do start to be informal, then it's for you to do that as well. But yeah,
it's a bit like emoticons. I think in your emails, you would never use an emoticon in a really professional working email,
like a smiley face.
But if you're with a friend and you're texting them, you'll be like littering your text with pictures of frogs and koalas and smiley faces and things like that. I think it's exactly the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, if in doubt, just follow the lead of the customer that you're speaking to, and avoid using anything informal. Yeah, just to be sure that just to make sure that you are getting with them at their level.
I think the way that you describe it is this is Australian English, but the English that we want you to use is what they call Queen's English, which is the proper English, afternoon, not arvo, Australian.
And that's what we use with each other. So, at work. So,
Yeah.
Most of the time.
Yeah,
I'm an offender.
Does that all sound okay? Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Was there anything else on this one? I think we were going to say something about the word already.
Yes.
Yeah.
We spoiled the next slide.
No, you can't get enough of the koala. We just wanted to say a thing about the word already. Already in Australian English, it's specific past tense. We only use it really as past tense. So you'd only use it when you're talking about something that has literally been done in the past, is not in the process of being done or about to be done or is being done now. It was done a while ago. So for an example would be, he didn't need to take out the rubbish because he'd already done it this morning. I think already is used in slightly different ways in certain parts of the world, but in Australian English it's definitely in the past, like definitely in the past, not now, not kind of,
because I think the way some of the sort of the incorrect by Australian English standards of using already that we encounter when it's used in a context of this is acknowledged and I'm going to action it
and make it
now.
Already, as in the two words already, but already doesn't mean already, it just means past tense, done and done.
I am already looking at this.
No,
you can just say I am
never
looking
say
at
that.
this.
It would make no sense to say I'm already looking at this. No, you'd say I've already looked at it.
Yeah, exactly. So already and looking don't, because you're saying that you're looking at it right now, which means that you could not have possibly already done anything to it.
Yeah, and it sometimes causes a little bit of confusion because we then have to clarify. So have you done this and completed it, or are you going to do it, or are you in the process of doing it? And it's can just create a little bit of uncertainty, I think.
Yeah. So again, the rule there is to only use the term already if something has already definitely been done in the past and isn't being worked on right now.
Yep. Okay, so cute animal time. So that's just to demonstrate that yes, we are the home of the cutest animal in the world, which is of course the koala. But it's also to demonstrate these slides how the Australian landscape is. So as we alluded to earlier, the vast majority and certainly the interior of Australia is just dry desert essentially, but there's a lot of scrub, so it's not necessarily just sand, but it's you can't grow crops on large parts of it. It's very, very dry. But on the other hand, just like the Philippines, we have massive coastline, lots of beaches, and that's where most of us live, as we mentioned before. I think many of us have grown up going to beaches, getting burned, that kind of thing.
Getting sand in our coffee.
Yeah, bringing sand home. But you guys are probably familiar with that as well. But yeah, so are we, very much so.
Something really interesting, I think. I mean, without going into a biology lesson about the Australian environment, something that's really, really interesting and quite unique to Australia is, like Ragni said, how dry a lot of the continent is, and how a lot of our plants have had to adapt to that dryness. So, for example, the plants in the picture in the bottom right, like the little grass tree down the bottom and the with yellow flowers at the top, those plants need dry conditions to be able to grow and germinate and reproduce and all those sorts of things. So it's not just a lack of water; they actually need and have adapted to dry conditions.
And Australia's indigenous people used to, and we only cottoned onto this decades ago, but they used to regularly set fire to bush. We call that backburning now, in order to help the crops grow. It's almost a kind of Aboriginal way of farming, if you like, to make sure that the plants keep growing, is to regularly burn them down, which sounds really weird and bizarre, but we figured out, the general population figured out that the Aboriginals were onto something decades back, and now it's standard practice to backburn, that is to deliberately burn forest in the winter so that when summer comes and bushfire season starts, because we get bushfires unfortunately
every year.
Yeah, around sort of December, January, just to make sure they're as small as possible. We like to do burning in the winter, because whatever we do, there's going to be fire, that's for sure.
And that plant, just as a side point, is the wattle tree that I mentioned before, the one where our national colours comes, the green and gold. Yeah.
If you see a wattle tree in the flesh, they're got to be one of the most beautiful trees in the world. But you've got to see it. You've got to sort of be right there, but it looks like golden tiny cotton buds or something all over a tree, and it's and the weird thing about it is if you try and cut it and take it home, it dies. It only flourishes on the branch. It's a very strange
the whole
one.
tree tends to die really quickly. I had one in my front garden and it just died one day. But the whole tree just died. It was so beautiful.
Maybe that's a comment on Australians somehow.
Okay, so that's a picture of Australian Aboriginals there, and that's there obviously in the traditional get-up that they would have been using for that. I don't know what that white line is, but
it's just sorry about that. I'm just trying to get rid of these lines on my screen, but I don't think they're gonna have much luck. We'll just have to ignore them.
Oh, sorry, laser light between one dude's face. So they're the original people of Australia, and they're our First Peoples. Quite affectionately, but of course it's been a pretty troubled history because 18th century British culture versus 18th century Aboriginal culture, pretty different. So when they came into contact with each other. So summary of Australian history. Sorry about the wordiness here. Australia was founded as a British colony on the 26th of January 1788. This date marks Australia Day. The first non-Aboriginal Australians were British convicts and British military. After gold was discovered in the mid-19th century, people came to Australia from all around the world, though mostly from Britain, seeking land and gold. It's a myth that most Australians are descended from convicts. The vast majority of us are descended from free settlers. Australia ceased to be a British colony 1901. However, Australia's ties to Britain would remain strong for decades to come. In fact, one of the first acts by Parliament, passed by Parliament, established the so-called White Australia policy, which essentially set Australia up as an offshoot nation of the United Kingdom. The founding ethos of Australia was originally to set up an egalitarian working man's paradise, initially reserved almost exclusively for British and their descendants, free of the constraints of the class system that prevailed back home in the mother country, which is to say in the United Kingdom. This egalitarian spirit was soon extended to Australian women the vote, which is earlier than the UK or the US. Over the course of the century, this egalitarian ethos would gradually extend itself to embracing multiculturalism as a defining cultural attribute, but that would come later. Returning to 1914, World War I breaks out and Australia sends hundreds of thousands of troops to fight for Britain. The Gallipoli campaign in Turkey was particularly momentous in helping to forge a sense of an Australian identity as opposed to a British one. Australian troops were as renowned for their lack of respect for authority. For example, many Australians refused to serve British commanders as they were for their bravery in war. Fast forward to World War II and Australia's ties with Britain became looser still. The war with Japan left a massive scar on the Australian psyche. The Japanese attacked both the north of the continent as well as the cities of Newcastle and Sydney in New South Wales with submarines. Tens of thousands of Australians died fighting the Japanese, and it was clear Britain could no longer be dependent to protect Australia's interests, leading to the need to forge a deal with the US and boost the local population by sourcing immigrants from non-British nations. Australia needed to stop seeing herself as British and instead populate or perish. Following World War II, Australia opened her doors to immigrants all of Europe. Large numbers of Italians and Greeks came and changed the Australian cultural landscape forever. From this point onwards, over the next 30 years, the White Australia policy is slowly but surely weakened into non-existence. In 1950 and again in 1965, Australia cemented her alliance with the US by sending troops to fight in America's wars. By 1975, the so-called White Australia policy was abandoned. Significant numbers of Lebanese and Vietnamese refugees in particular came to settle in Australia. Australia increasingly pulled away from its British roots. By 1986, Australian legal cases could no longer be appealed to the Privy Council in England. In 1992, the Citizenship Act was amended to remove swearing an oath of allegiance to the British Crown. In 1999, there was a referendum make Australia a republic and remove the British Queen as our head of state. However, this failed, with a slim majority voting to retain the status quo. Most importantly, in 2000, we hosted the best Olympic Games ever, much better than the Melbourne ones in 1956. In 2008, the Australian government formally apologised for past wrongs committed against the Indigenous population, which was a very significant moment. In 2010, we got our first female minister, and this year, in 2015, it is a momentous year because this is the highest proportion of Australians born overseas in the last 120 years. So 28% of our population was born overseas, including me in the United Kingdom, as were most people who were born overseas in Australia, but there were also many New Zealanders, Chinese, Indians, Filipinos, Vietnamese, Italians, South Africans, Malaysians, and so that's a rundown of the history of Australia. I hope it wasn't too wordy.
Thank you. I guess the of understanding a bit of Australian history is to sort of get an idea, I guess, of why we are the way we are now. So I think one that Ragni emphasised was the idea of us in the past saluting our superiors in war and stuff like that, and that sort of has translated to modern day where we sort of shirk's not the right word. Yeah, we don't necessarily abide by formalities, and we see the British class system as something which is so foreign and something that we definitely don't want in Australia.
Even we have an American colleague who sometimes talks to calling them sir. Even that makes me go, oh, what are you doing? Yeah. Why are you calling your officer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have a very Australian thing called tall poppy syndrome, I think, where if anybody sort of tries to talk themselves up or say that they're better than somebody else, we pull your head in and we sort of try and cut them down to size and bring them back in line with everybody. I think that's a very Australian characteristic.
I think, vegetarianism and diversity, they're two sort of very Australian things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to give you a brief overview of our political system, we do an Australian constitution, and under that constitution we have three main branches of government. We have our legislative power, we have our executive power, and we have our judicial power. The legislative executive powers, the lines between those two are blurred, mainly because they're both the political branches, so there are ministers, I suppose, in both of those branches. But the main separation that we have is between those two political branches and our judicial power. So there is strict insulation of the judiciary, so our courts and magistrates, judges, things like that. There's strict insulation from the political branches, and it's a very fundamental principle of our constitution. So they don't interfere with one another. So judges don't interfere with the laws that are made, and people who make our laws, so the legislative and the executive, don't interfere with judicial decisions. They might make a comment on it, but there's definitely no interference at all. I think maybe the closest thing to overlap is the fact that our Attorney General, who sits within the executive power, appoints judges.
Judges are very protective of their judicial discretion, as they call it. So they don't like being told to just do, they don't want to rubber stamp anything.
Yeah.
But we also, the other thing to note about our constitution is, unlike the US and many other countries, we have no Bill of Rights. So we don't have freedom of speech enshrined by law, just enshrined by cultural values, but not by law.
That's not to say that we don't have it, because we do. It's just not something which is codified.
We've got freedom of political communication, which is much less sexy. Much less attractive.
It's just not codified. I think that's the only difference. It's not sort of black lettable.
That's right.
Here is attention to Amber, PO Box 6919.
None. It's somewhat similar to what we have, like the form of government that we have here. Just a little different. Yep.
Yeah, okay. I think most countries aim towards this sort of this type of government. I think some do it more effectively than others, or maybe for some the separation between the powers is sort of in theory, but in practice doesn't necessarily happen. But it's something that we are very proud of in Australia. Here is just a slide to show you basically all the publications that we publish here. So our loose leaves and our books and things like that, this is where they go. So the guy in the middle of the slide is the former federal court judge Ron Merkel, who is carrying our Australian immigration law loose leaf to or from court. Or
he looks very happy with it, as you can see.
He looks very, very pleased. And you can read more about that particular case in that link that's provided on the slide. And then the picture in the bottom right is something that you see a lot around the court. So up in Martin Place in the Central Business District, they're our loose leaves on a trolley pushed by a lawyer. The lady in the middle is holding an iPad, no doubt looking at our LexisNexis Red publications. And the girl on the left in the pink blouse has a lot of books. And I think there's things to note about this slide other than the fact that they're looking at our publications. It shows the increasing dominance of women in the legal profession. There used to be a very sort of white, middle-aged male profession, but women are definitely making up a larger and larger proportion of graduates. It shows how multicultural our legal profession is in Sydney in general. I guess, and the use of our Lexis publications, and I think there are a couple of competitor CCH ones on there as well, which we don't like to see, but we can just ignore those.
Yeah, I guess this is to give you, I do actually using one of these photos in the previous training that I provided you just on our products generally, but I guess again, just to emphasize, this is the context that you're doing every day. People are using our products every single day in courtrooms, in legal offices, in other contexts, and they rely on our material to do their work and to conduct their business and to achieve outcomes for their clients. So yeah, I find this slide to be really encouraging. I guess it puts into context what I do every day, what I turn up to work for every day. I hope it encourages you as well in the work that you do.
I agree.
So just the next two slides, we're running out of time, but the next slides are, I think, probably the more important for the rest of the presentation. In Australia, we are very proud of, and we have a very strongly ingrained welfare and security system. So the idea is that nobody is left behind. Obviously, we do have citizens who are homeless, people who use...
We call them povos.
Povos. Correct me. People who you might see homeless on the street. busking or but the idea generally is that we don't have anybody who is left behind, and usually people who are homeless are in that more for other reasons other than just financial.
A lot of our beggars that we see, they're mentally ill, or
alcohol dependency.
Yeah, alcoholics, or they've temporarily been, pushed out of home. But we don't. When I walk past a beggar, I would never think that person would be going hungry for any longer than a few hours. The idea is that the government will
assist anybody.
Mop up and make sure that people don't get. They're never driven to desperate situations that shouldn't happen in Australia.
Yeah. We have a wide range of benefits and payments which are made available by the Australian government and which is through the general taxes that we pay, which assist people at different points in their life. So if you are struggling, for example, you can't afford to pay rent, or you have lots of kids, or you're disabled, or you're older and you can't work, you might get different types of benefits, so family tax benefits, rental assistance, disability support, and these payments are means tested, which means that they only go to the people who need them most. So they're not, for example, I could never access any of these benefits. You would have to be in a state which warranted it.
But we do pay tax through the nose.
Well, we like to complain about it.
Taxes are very high compared to the rest of the world.
Are they?
Yeah. They're close to 50%. That's high.
Yeah, okay. It depends how much you earn, of course, but yeah. The one thing which is available to everybody is what we have, something called, which is something that we are very, very proud of, and we're very hesitant to move towards a more American system of healthcare, which we see to be not as equitable. But basically what Medicare does is it provides access to medical and hospital services and also financial support for medical expenses for all Australian residents.
Yes, if you turn up to emergency in an Australian hospital, public hospital, they'll take you in. They won't say, "Where's the money?" And they'll worry about the money later.
And you can go to a doctor. Some people can go to the doctor for free. It depends on the medical practice, but that can be, I know I've been to medical centres across the road from our offices here, and I've not had to pay anything. I've just had to have a Medicare number. But they're all paid for by general taxation. So I'll just whip through the next slide. Which is something that we wanted to emphasise, is I think we have very distinct family and personal life characteristics in Australia. So the trend generally is for us to marry later in life and have children later in life, so more towards the early 30s than early to mid 20s. Divorce is legal. A lot of families are blended, so two people who might be previously married with children from previous relationships can remarry. We also have something called a de facto couple, which is basically a couple which has the same legal rights, for example, relating to property division, spousal maintenance, things like that, as a married couple. So they don't have to marry, they just have to have been in a domestic relationship for 2 years or more. And that can be any two individuals, so same-sex, man and woman, traditional relationships.
And it's actually often a precursor. So relationships are often what comes before marriage. I would say, like, I was in a de facto relationship with my husband for years before we formally married. And that's very normal in Australia.
Or for example, I mean, obviously we don't want to use too many personal examples, but my aunt and uncle have been together for 30 years and they are de facto. They've never gotten married. They live together. And they don't need to legally. They have the same legal rights as a couple who is married. We also have a lot of religious freedom in Australia. We are a very secular society, so basically that means that religious ideologies form the basis of any government policy or legislation. Religion and government are completely separate. Australians are very spiritually eclectic. And we have lots of different expressions of religion. So you might be culturally religious, you might be spiritually religious, and it's not just about whether you believe in God, it's about where you've come from, your family,
A lot of
things
Irish
like that.
Australians, they're very proud of being Catholic, but
Even if they don't believe in God,
Yeah.
they
don't
call themselves
necessarily
Catholic.
practice it.
Yeah. And we don't necessarily talk about religion. Some of my closest friends, I wouldn't have a clue what their religion is.
yeah.
I don't necessarily need to know.
I think religion's considered a very personal thing in Australia, and like it's super personal. It's not just personal; it's a super personal thing to some extent.
And it can be divisive, which is why we choose not to talk about it that often.
Yeah.
It's not related to work, and it's generally not discussed at work. And I think there's a little graph on the side. I think something which is really important to remember is that a lot of Australians don't identify as being religious at all. So at the last census, which is a survey of the entire Australian population in 2011, almost 25%, so almost a quarter of Australians said that they weren't religious at all.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the key points there are that religion doesn't necessarily affect the way Australia is governed and our laws and how things operate here, but also it is very much kept out of the workplace, and it can be considered quite inappropriate to be asking colleagues questions about their religion. So it's best.
Were there any questions about that?
None so far. Oh, good. That has been helpful.
Yeah, great. We've sort of run out of time. There's just a few.
Fun stuff.
I know, there's the fun stuff to go.
The fun stuff.
Do you have a few minutes for us just to quickly finish up, or do you need to leave the meeting?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Yep. So in Australia, we have a real identity issue around what our national cuisine or our national food is. It's a constant struggle amongst all of us to try and figure out what do we eat, what is characteristic of being an Australian, what do we eat every night when we go home. And I think because of our cultural backgrounds, it makes it quite difficult to define. We all enjoy cuisines from all over the world, and I think generally, if you could pinpoint anything, the main thing that defines Australian cuisine is that it is fresh, it is local, lots of seafood. I know at Christmas time, my family, we all eat prawns and fish, and
That's the same for me.
yeah, it's we don't do the sort of warm turkey Christmas
No.
that the UK.
Tried that, it doesn't work.
No, it doesn't work in Australia because it's usually 40 degrees at Christmas time. And also that it's diverse. So during the week, we might cook
I think
an Asian dish, an Italian dish.
I think most, at least Sydney siders, eat Asian food very regularly. I would eat it probably 4 times a week. It's integral to my diet, as is the more traditional kind of British origin
Meat and 3 veg.
steak. Yeah, meat and 3 veg. That's what I home. But when I go out, I only eat Asian food most of the time.
Yeah, here in Chatswood, for example, we have a whole array of cuisine, including a Filipino restaurant just close to the office here, which I've been to several times. So I'll show you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's just to give you an idea where Australians are very used to eating from all over the world. There's no one kind of type of food that we eat or that we're not used to.
But if we were to pick some things that Australians like to enjoy and which we send in boxes to Australian friends overseas who might be a bit homesick, it's Tim Tams, which we've all tried at some point with visitors when visitors from Australia come over to the offices in Manila. We've got Vegemite, which is an acquired taste, and you have to eat it properly, otherwise it's disgusting.
Yeah.
Basically, as little as possible onto a piece of warm buttered bread. We've got clover, which is in the bottom right, which is something that we battle with the New Zealanders over. In terms of ownership, they said that it's theirs, we say that it's ours, and I think
It's ours.
it's ours.
It's basically meringue with freshly whipped cream and fresh fruit.
Yep.
And the meat pie, which is something that you have to be able to eat with one hand standing up and maybe a beer in the other hand. Very, very Australian. Just a few sort of Aussie celebrities and other forms of media that you might have come in contact with. You've got Wolverine, which is not an Australian film, but Hugh Jackman is definitely
Very Australian.
Yep. Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban both live in the United States, but they're Aussie through and through. I think they have property down south.
And he doesn't
don't they?
sing in an Australian accent. Shame on him.
Because he's singing in the Nashville American.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I was
Kate Blanchett, the movie on Romeo and Juliet by an Australian director, Baz Luhrmann. He also directed Rouge, the movie Australia, which funnily enough is about Australia. Happy Feet, the bottom left, George Miller directed that one. He's an Australian. Chris Hemsworth, the bottom in the middle, he is Thor.
And interestingly, TV series called Vikings, and the main character in Vikings, which is a foreign-made thing, is Australian as well.
Yeah.
So when you want to get uber masculine,
Hot.
yeah.
And the bottom right is Home and Away. That's an Aussie TV show which has been exported all over the world, and I think people in the United Kingdom think that it's never winter in Australia, and that we all live on the beach and we all run around with surf for our arms and wearing bikinis and looking into the sunset and things like that. But it's a very stereotypical view of Australia, and not a lot of Australians, I don't think, watch that show anymore. It's very much for the export market, I suspect.
Yeah.
But it's a stereotypical surfy Aussie picture that they want to present. We love our sport, Australia, particularly things like AFL and rugby. So the bottom left is an AFL game. The top left, one of our track stars, Sally Pearson, she does hurdles. Top right is Nick Kyrgios. He's a up-and-coming tennis player in Australia. And bottom right is our swim team, all the medals that we win at Olympics and other events.
And you know sports is important in Australia because when you watch Australian news, you get about 12 minutes of proper news, and then it's followed by another 12 minutes of nothing but rugby and cricket and maybe
and it's very common during the sport seasons, the top stories on this be things like a coach has resigned or...
So yeah, you can have seriously 50% of the news program is often just sport.
And it's for someone who is not into sport really at all. I feel very, very un-Australian to say that I don't understand rugby and I don't understand AFL, and I think it's a waste of time and a waste of space. And I watch the news.
Oh, there'd be so many.
No, I know, and I get... People tease me for it, but anyway. And then this is the final slide, one other main character of Australians is that we have so much outdoor space and so much natural beauty that a lot of our weekends and free time is spent outdoors as much as possible. Obviously, that's also a generalisation and a bit of a stereotype that I love getting out and going for a bushwalk or a hike or skiing or going to the beach, but it's not the same for everybody. So the top right is two people snorkeling on the Great Barrier Reef, and you can see in the middle there's a little Nemo fish, which is cute. The bottom right is Bondi Beach, which is our most famous beach. It's not the best beach, but it's definitely the most famous. Bottom left, a barbecue, and the top left is just a nice shot of some outdoor walking tracks in Tasmania, which is the island state off the bottom.
So I think all Australians have been bushwalking, which other lingo, it's walking through a forest or woods.
Or hiking, I guess.
We call it bush though, which is apparently peculiar to Australia.
Yeah, and bushfires. We call them bushfires, not forest fires.
Going to the beach, that's a very Australian. Not the snorkeling though. That's for your toffee-nosed Australians, I think. But it's very expensive. But the bushwalking and going to the beach and the barbecue, getting drunk in the middle of the day, they are definitely very, very experiences.
Yeah, and we're proud of it.
Yeah,
definitely. So there's only one more slide which has some links. Some further links and some other resources. The top link is a video that we were going to play, but I don't think we have time to play it now, but I would recommend that you all watch it in your own time. It gives a really good feel for the Australian sense of humor, which is very self-deprecating, very tongue-in-cheek. We like to poke fun at ourselves. We don't take ourselves too seriously. It also gives of some Aussie language, and it's a bit of fun and it's a bit funny. So And it shows you a couple of Aussie bogans, which is good. So I definitely watched that first,
They're
How
quite
to
good
Speak.
looking.
And then, they're looking, would we say
Not
that?
bad. They're okay.
So the top video, How to Speak Australian, I would definitely watch that. And just some more educational resources, the political systems, some Australian Geographic and Bureau of Statistics stuff.
Yeah, so I'll send these slides through now so that you can take a look at all those other resources if you like, and so that you can use it as a reference, use the whole deck as a reference point. Are there any questions before we finish up? And I know we have gone over time, sorry about that.
That's okay. No problem.
No further questions from us. Just a big thank you because this will be very useful for us.
That's really great to hear. You're very welcome, and let us know if you need anything else or any clarification. We're always happy to help.
And we're looking forward to receive a copy of the deck. Thank you.
No worries, I'll send it now. Okay, we'll talk to you all later.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys. Bye.
Okay.